I was merely the caretaker, secreted away with the Alpha's younglings, while the entire clan made ready for the union festivities. Little did I suspect that the Alpha King himself had forsaken the ceremony, his gaze locked upon me for reasons I could not fathom until he performed the unthinkable. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Walls. The aroma of warm milk and fresh linen constituted Kelly's entire existence. It permeated the heavy drapes, settled into the plush carpet, and lingered in the very air she inhaled. Here, within the royal nursery, she found solace. Here she remained unseen, a specter with tender hands and a gentle voice, compensated to be overlooked. She hummed a low, unmelodious tune, cradling the youngest of the Alpha's pups. Little Lyra, adorned with a tuft of silver hair and eyes that promised the same tempestuous nature as her sire. The pup finally drifted off, a soft exhalation escaping her tiny lips, and Kelly experienced that familiar ache in her chest, a hollow longing for something she knew was perpetually out of reach, a family, a partner, a place of belonging not confined by the four walls of her service. This sentiment was a perilous indulgence, so she suppressed it, interring it deeply beneath layers of obligation. For duty was straightforward, and yearning was a path to ruin. She understood this better than anyone. Beyond the imposing oak door, the sounds of the clan preparing for the grand ceremony permeated the air. Laughter, the clinking of glassware, the rustle of fine fabrics. This evening, Alpha King Colin was slated to commence his official pursuit of Aluna, a queen for their dominion. The very notion sent a chill down her spine, a phantom ache from a wound that never fully healed. She carefully placed Lyra into her cot, the tiny wolfling curling into a ball of slumber. It was her responsibility to safeguard the clan's future, even if she was forbidden from ever being a part of it. Just as she turned to attend to Leo, Lyra's twin, the nursery doors swung open soundlessly. Lady Ara stood there, a vision of frigid beauty clad in a gown the shade of a winter sky. Her silver tresses were artfully braided, diamonds glinting like hoarfrost. She was not observing the pups. Her gaze, sharp and disdainful, swept over Kelly, lingering for a mere fraction of a second before dismissing her as mere decoration, a blemish upon the otherwise immaculate chamber. That look, it was identical to the one she had endured her entire life, the look that proclaimed impurity, the look that alluded to her parents' disgrace, a transgression she was compelled to bear like a shroud. Ara's lips tightened into a grimace of distaste before she turned and departed, the door clicking shut, leaving silence in her wake. What exactly did my parents do? No one would ever reveal the complete narrative, only that their perfidy had nearly shattered the clan decades prior. It was a legacy of infamy, and it was hers alone to carry. Consequently, she found herself retreating further into her duties, her movements becoming more subdued, more precise, eradicating any trace of her presence. She straightened the bedding, folded the spare linens, her mind a tempest of ancient hurts. She recalled another man, a beta she had believed she loved, his words like stones flung at her heart. No alpha will ever select the offspring of traitors. You are dispensable, Kelly, always will be. His casual cruelty had branded her soul, a truth she had long since accepted. The clan required a strong Luna, a noble woman such as Lady Era, not a broken Omega whose very lineage was a curse. She was nothing more than the Governess. The sounds from the celebration outside intensified, a wave of noise and anticipation. They were cheering for their king. They were awaiting their new queen. A sharp, piercing wail shattered the nursery's tranquility, jolting Kelly from her somber reflections. Leo was awake, his small face contorted in redness, his fists clenched in distress. His cries grew louder, a desperate, heart-wrenching sound that mirrored the dread within her own spirit. She scooped him up, his small form trembling against her. She rocked him, soothed him, but his cries only escalated. So she resorted to the only method she knew. She began to sing. It was an old melody, a lullaby, her own mother had sung to her in hushed tones, a tune of moonlight and forgotten enchantment. The words flowed from her, gentle and comforting, enveloping the distressed pup like a warm covering. His cries subsided, then fractured into silence. He gazed up at her, his dark eyes wide and trusting. Lost in the moment, in the simple peace of comforting a child, Kelly was entirely oblivious that her song, her private melody, was not contained by the nursery's thick walls. It was drifting through the stone passageways, a thread of sound weaving its way through the revelry, seeking a restless spirit it was never destined to encounter. Chapter 2. A Melody of Fate. The final note of the lullaby faded, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. The silence in the nursery felt different now, heavier, as if holding its breath. Kelly held Leo close, his warmth a small comfort against the chill of her own solitude. Her song had exerted its charm, but the peace it brought was ephemeral, easily disrupted. She could still perceive the distant thrum of the festivities, a persistent reminder of the world she observed from the periphery. As she gently placed the sleeping pup back into his crib, 2 attendants hurried past the nursery door, their voices sharp whispers that pierced the stillness. "Did you witness her?" "Lady Alara appears regal already," one remarked, her tone brimming with admiration. "The Alpha King would be unwise not to claim her this night. They were previously involved, you know, before the northern conflict altered him." The second attendant lowered her voice. "Hush now! Such matters are not discussed. But you are correct. Her lineage is impeccable. He requires a strong mate to stabilize his wolf. They say it has been agitated ever since his return. Restless." The words struck Kelly like tiny, sharp fragments. Impeccable lineage. Her own felt like a contagion, a stain she could not eradicate. She turned away from the door, her hands automatically smoothing a wrinkle in a blanket. Her focus narrowed to the simple, repetitive task. This was preferable. Better not to listen, not to hope, not to feel, because emotion invariably led to heartache. The attendants' voices receded down the corridor, but their pronouncements echoed in her mind, intermingling with the phantom pain of the beta's rejection. No alpha will ever desire you. He was right, naturally. Why would a king, particularly one with a restless wolf, ever grant a second glance to someone like her, someone whose name was synonymous with disgrace? Despite her efforts to suppress it, the gnawing sense of inadequacy gnawed at her. She was a phantom within this castle, her sole purpose, to be a caregiver, a temporary placeholder until the pups no longer required her attention. Then what? Where would she go? The question was a terrifying, bottomless abyss she refused to contemplate. She busied herself tidying toys that were already perfectly arranged, her movements a quiet rebellion against the turmoil within her heart. She belonged here in the silence with the innocent. That had to suffice. It simply had to. What alternative did she possess? Could an individual truly outrun the transgressions of their progenitors? A sudden shift in the ambiance caused her to freeze, her hand suspended above a small wooden wolf. The distant din from the great hall seemed to vanish, muffled into nothingness. The air in the corridor beyond the nursery grew thick, heavy with an unseen force. It felt as though the world had ceased to breathe. The 2 pups in their cradles stirred simultaneously, not crying, but sensing it too. A primal awareness flickered within the chamber, an ancient instinct she was unaware of possessing, causing the hairs on her arms to stand on end. Someone was approaching. This presence was unlike the fleeting arrogance of Lady Ara, or the hurried footsteps of the staff. This was immense, a force of nature moving through the castle. The nursery door creaked open slowly this time. The deliberate sound reverberated in the sudden, deafening quiet. Kelly's heart leaped into her throat, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She anticipated a guard, perhaps one of the elders. She slowly turned, her body rigid with a fear she could not identify. A colossal figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, obscuring the light from the hall. He was enormous, his shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire frame. She could not discern his countenance, only the sheer, overwhelming power emanating from him in waves. It was a tangible entity, a crushing weight that made respiration difficult. Then she heard it, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It was not a word, it was a growl, and it was not emanating from the pups. Chapter 3. The Glowing Cinders. He moved from the shadows into the soft lamplight of the nursery. Time seemed to distort, stretching and decelerating as Kelly's mind struggled to comprehend his appearance. The Alpha King. He was larger than she had ever conceived, a creature of raw, untamed might compressed into human form. His black tunic was unfastened at the neck, a stark contrast to the formal attire everyone else wore this evening, and his dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it in frustration. He did not resemble a king at a ceremony. He appeared as a predator in pursuit, but it was his eyes that ensnared her, that stole the very air from her lungs. They held a peculiar, captivating luminescence, akin to the glowing embers of a dying fire, and they were fixed upon her with a terrifying intensity. Fear, cold and sharp, coursed through her. In his proximity, she felt like a mouse caught within the gaze of a hawk. Her training, her life of servitude took hold. She dropped into a deep curtsy, her head bowed, her eyes fixed upon the floorboards. "Do not see me. Do not see me. Please, just depart." She endeavored to make herself diminutive, to fold inward until she was no more than a crumpled shadow on the floor. To be noticed by anyone of high standing was a gamble. To be noticed by the Alpha King, that was a death sentence. He was the one who upheld the clan laws, the very statutes that kept her ostracized. Following that initial impulse, an eternity seemed to pass in the charged silence. The only sound was the frantic drumming of her own heart. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply observed her. She could feel his gaze upon her bowed head, a physical weight pressing down. The air crackled with an energy she had never before experienced, a wild, primal hum that made her teeth ache. It was his wolf. She could sense its stirrings just beneath his skin, a violent, restless entity that was solely focused upon her. Why? Why was he present? Had she committed an offense? Was he here to expel her for some unacknowledged transgression? Kelly, his voice. It was not loud, but it filled the entire chamber, a low, guttural rumble that resonated deep within her bones. It was not the voice of a king addressing a subordinate. It was possessive. It was a claim. The single utterance shattered her composure. She looked up, unable to restrain herself. His eyes were now ablaze, the golden embers incandescent with an emotion she could not decipher. It resembled desperation. It resembled hunger. His chest rose and fell in a deep, controlled rhythm, but a muscle in his jaw twitched, betraying the tempest raging within him. He took a step forward, then another, bridging the distance between them with the fluid grace of a hunter. She scrambled backward, every instinct screaming at her to flee. Her back struck the solid wood of Lyra's cot, the edge digging into her spine. Trapped, he stood over her, a mountain of muscle and fury and something else, something that felt perilously akin to reverence. He extended a hand, large and calloused, and she flinched, anticipating a blow. But he did not strike her. He did not touch her face or her hair. His fingers closed around her wrist. His grip was like steel, inescapable. Yet a shocking surge of warmth shot from his skin to hers, a searing heat that traveled up her arm and directly to her heart. It was not painful. It was an awakening. For a breathtaking moment, he merely held her there, his thumbs caressing the delicate skin of her wrist, his burning eyes scrutinizing her face as if memorizing every detail. Then, without a word, he turned, drawing her effortlessly to her feet and pulling her toward the door. She stumbled after him, her mind a blank canvas of shock and terror. As they reached the doorway, he paused, his gaze sweeping over her one last time, the golden light in his eyes flaring into a possessive inferno. A growl ripped from his chest, a single, definitive utterance that echoed in the hallway and irrevocably sealed her fate. Mine. Chapter 4. The King's Decree. The word resonated. Mine. It was not a mere word. It was a brand seared into the air, into her very soul. Then the world dissolved into a blur. Kalen's grip on her wrist was an iron manacle, and he was propelling her, dragging her from the serene sanctuary of the nursery into the heart of the storm. The stone floor felt cold and unforgiving beneath her thin slippers, a stark contrast to the searing heat radiating from his physique. Tapestries depicting ancient battles and legendary hunts blurred past her vision, their woven threads a smear of color in her panicked sight. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, the sound of a destiny she never sought charging forward. Hers were a frantic, stumbling patter, the sound of a terrified creature attempting to escape an already locked enclosure. No, no, this cannot be transpiring. It is a misapprehension, a cruel, terrible dream. Her simple gray governess dress felt like burlap, a symbol of her humble station for all to witness. She was a sparrow being dragged into an eagle's eyrie. They burst through the towering doors of the great hall. A wave of sound, music, laughter, conversation washed over them, only to die in an instant. 1,000 conversations choked into silence. 1,000 pairs of eyes swiveled to fixate upon them, upon her. The chamber was a galaxy of glittering lights from the massive chandeliers, a sea of silks and jewels and perfectly sculpted countenances. And every single face was turned toward the spectacle of their alpha king, their untamed leader, holding the wrist of a terrified, plainly featured governess, as if she were spoils of war. The air grew thick with unspoken queries, with shock that rapidly curdled into disbelief and then into contempt. Kelly yearned to shrink, to wither into nothingness beneath the weight of their collective gaze. She could feel their judgment like a physical blow, their scorn, 1,000 tiny needles piercing her skin. But Callan did not falter. He did not appear to notice the stunned silence or the dawning horror etched on the faces of his clan. He moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, pulling her through the parted crowd. Nobles in their finery scrambled out of his path, their expressions a mixture of fear and outrage. He did not halt until they reached the elevated dais at the front of the hall, where the 2 ornate thrones sat vacant. He drew her up the steps, his presence so immense he seemed to eclipse the very chamber. He stopped beside the Alpha's throne, a masterpiece of carved oak and dark fir, and turned to confront the silent clan. And he did not release her. Instead, he raised their joined hands high for all to witness, the king and the servant. A gasp, sharp and collective, rippled through the hall. His voice, when he spoke, was not the measured tone of a ruler. It was the raw, guttural roar of a wolf claiming its territory. This evening, you anticipated I would select a Luna. His gaze swept across the assembly, challenging, daring any of them to look away. You expected a choice based on politics, on lineage, on expediency. He paused, the silence in the hall so absolute that Kelly could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. Then his burning gaze descended upon her, and for a moment the fury in his eyes softened into something she could not name. My wolf has made its decision. My heart and my very soul have chosen. He looked back at the clan, his voice dropping to a deadly, possessive growl that left no room for rebuttal. This woman is my mate. Chapter 5. A Throne of Thorns. The king's declaration shattered the quiet, and in its place, a venomous tide of whispers erupted. The governess, her parents were traitors. This is an affront to the clan. The words were like a swarm of angry hornets, stinging and relentless. Kelly trembled, her world tilting on its axis. This was worse than a nightmare, because in a nightmare, one eventually awakens. This was reality. The hostility emanating from the crowd was a physical force threatening to crush her. From this new vantage point, her life of quiet servitude had concluded, replaced by a terrifying, unwanted role at the epicenter of a brewing tempest. She instinctively attempted to withdraw her hand from Callan's grasp, a desperate, futile effort to sever this impossible connection, but his fingers tightened, an unyielding anchor in the maelstrom. Just as the murmurs began to escalate into a roar of dissent, a figure emerged from the throng. Lord Valerius, the head of the Elder Council, his silver hair gleaming like a crown of frost, stepped forward, his countenance a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Alpha King," he began, his voice resonating with authority, a clear challenge to Kalen's own. "You cannot be serious. The law is unequivocal. Tradition is absolute. The Luna must be of noble bloodline, a she-wolf who can strengthen the pack, not diminish it with a legacy of shame." Every word was a deliberate wound aimed to humiliate her, to remind everyone of the stain she bore. The shame was a living entity, coiling in her gut, hot and suffocating. She longed to bolt, to flee until her lungs burned and the world ceased to exist, but Kalen's grip held her fast. Kalen remained utterly still, a predator observing, waiting. He allowed the elders' words to hang in the air, a testament to the clan's indignation. He permitted the weight of their disapproval to settle upon Kelly's shoulders, compelling her to feel the full extent of the chasm he had just created. Only when Valerius had finished did Kalen finally move. He turned his head slowly, his glowing gaze pinning the elder in place. A low snarl vibrated in his chest, a sound so primal it sent a fresh wave of fear through the hall. "The law serves the clan," Kalen growled, his voice dangerously soft. "And my mate will strengthen this clan because she is mine. Her legacy is now my legacy." He took a menacing step forward, drawing Kelly with him. "Challenge my choice, Valerius, and you challenge me." The threat was unmistakable. To oppose his selection was treason. Before the elder could respond, another voice, smooth as silk and sharp as glass, cut through the tension. "Kalen." Lady Ara glided forward, her icy composure a stark contrast to the king's raw fury. Her eyes were fixed upon Kalen, filled with a hurt and rage that felt far more personal than the council's political objections. "After all these years, after everything, you would disgrace your own throne with her." The words were a poisoned dart, hinting at a shared history, at broken promises. It was not merely about the crown. For Ara, this was about a profound, personal betrayal. Is this what love engenders? Does it curdle into something so hateful? Kalen did not even grant her a glance. His focus remained locked on the council, his message unambiguous. Her sentiments were inconsequential. With a final dismissive glare at Valerius, he made his decision. He turned his back on the council, on Ara, on the entire stunned and mutinous assembly. In that singular act, he chose her over his kingdom. He chose his governess over his duty. And with his hand still clasped around her wrist, he pulled her from the dais, leaving behind a throne of thorns and a clan on the brink of rebellion, dragging her away from the public execution of her former life and towards the terrifying privacy of his own. Chapter 6. The Scent of a Soul. The heavy oak door of the royal chambers slammed shut, the sound booming with a dreadful finality. They were alone. The opulent chamber, which should have been breathtaking, felt like a confinement. A grand stone hearth stood unlit and still. Enormous bookshelves stretched towards the lofty ceiling, and the floor was adorned with the hides of beasts that Kalen had likely hunted himself. It was the lair of a predator, and she had just been dragged into its very core. He finally relinquished her wrist. The skin was raw and tingling from the force of his grasp, a stark testament to his possession. He didn't spare her a glance. Instead, he began to pace, his movements imbued with a restless, suppressed intensity that permeated the expansive room, making it feel constricted and oppressive. He was a wolf confined to its enclosure, and she was trapped within it alongside him. The silence stretched, dense and unbearable. At length, a small quavering voice managed to escape her throat. It was her own. "Why?" She barely breathed, her sound almost imperceptible. "Why would you do that? It must be a misunderstanding." Kalen halted his perambulation and slowly turned to face her. The unbridled fury from the grand hall had vanished, replaced by something far more disquieting. The golden luminescence in his eyes remained, but now it was tinged with a desperate, agonizing sorrow. For the first time, she observed a fissure in the formidable facade of the Alpha King. She perceived a vulnerability that echoed the terror within her own heart. "It is no misunderstanding," he stated, his voice hoarse with an emotion she could not identify. He drew a deep, shuddering breath. "For 5 years, since the conflict in the north, my existence has been devoid of color, muted." He gestured vaguely around the chamber. "My wolf's senses have been impaired. I can barely perceive my own pack. Sustenance tastes like cinders. The world is a haze." The admission was astonishing. A hidden frailty laid bare. This illuminated the hushed gossip of the servants, the volatile energy he exuded. He lived in a sensory confinement. "But you," he took a step closer, his gaze unwavering and intense. "When you sang, it was as if the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time. I followed the sound, and then your scent." He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment as if cherishing a memory. "It is the sole thing I can perceive with clarity. Jasmine, moonlight, and home. You are the only entity in this world that feels tangible to me." His rationale was not born of affection or predestination, but from a desperate, primal imperative. She was his remedy, his anchor in a reality that had faded into nothingness. The revelation was disorienting, a confluence of pity and a terrifying sense of obligation. Was this her destiny, to be a tool for a broken sovereign? He discerned the conflict in her eyes, the apprehension warring with bewilderment. He prowled towards her once more, his imposing frame pressing her against the unyielding edge of a substantial mahogany desk. He leaned in, his warmth and scent, an untamed blend of pine and ozone, enveloping her. "You feel it too, do you not?" he murmured. His voice, a low growl, resonated through her. "This certainty, this irrefutable connection, it is the mating bond. It has awakened within me, and it has chosen you." He was so close now, his lips mere inches from her ear. She was ensnared by his stature, by his words, by this impossible reality. The primal part of her, the subordinate she kept deeply concealed, acknowledged the veracity of his declaration. There was a pull, a terrifying, undeniable affinity that hummed between them. Yet her mind, her wounded heart, screamed for escape. A single, desperate notion flashed through her consciousness. Rejection. It was her sole recourse. As if he had perceived her silent plea, his body became rigid. A lethal coldness suffused his eyes. He leaned in even closer, his breath a warm puff against her skin that sent a shiver down her spine. His subsequent words were not a request, nor a plea. They were a vow, a terrifying, world-altering promise. "Reject me," he whispered, his voice a silken threat, "and I will reduce this world to dust." Chapter 7. The Gilded Confinement. The dawn arrived not with the gentle stirring of younglings, but with the stark, impersonal luminescence of a sunbeam piercing a vast, unfamiliar chamber. Kelly awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was adrift in an ocean of silken sheets and downy pillows, the aroma of lavender and old wealth supplanting the familiar, comforting scent of milk and baby powder. This was not her room. It was a gilded cage, resplendent, but a cage nonetheless. Kaylin's ultimatum from the previous night reverberated in the stillness, a promise of devastation that had robbed her of sleep and left her exposed. "Reject me, and I will burn this world to ash." He had left her here, in the heart of the royal wing, a captive to his desperate claim, survival. That was her singular objective now. She had to grasp the rules of this terrifying new existence before it utterly consumed her. Later, 2 attendants entered without preamble, their faces deliberately impassive. They carried armfuls of garments in rich jewel tones, emerald, sapphire, ruby, fabrics she had only ever glimpsed from afar. The attire felt like a costume for a role she did not know how to inhabit. The maids worked in silence, their movements precise, their gazes studiously avoiding hers. It was a novel form of invisibility. Previously, she was overlooked due to her insignificance. Now she was shunned as a scandal, a living, breathing crisis clad in a simple servant's attire, a queen without allies, a mate without love. She was more isolated than she had ever felt in her cramped attic room. A profound yearning, a primal ache, drew at her. She had to see the pups. Their innocent, trusting faces were her solitary lifeline in this tempest. With a surge of resolve, she moved towards the door, her hand reaching for the cool brass handle. "Forgive me, my lady." A voice, polite yet firm as iron, halted her. A royal guard, clad in the silver and black of the Alpha's personal contingent, stood just outside her chamber. He had not been present when she succumbed to sleep. "The Alpha King has issued explicit directives. You are to remain within these chambers for your own protection." The title, "my lady," felt like a cruel jest. It was a courtesy extended to a prisoner. Her last tether to her former life, her sole solace, was now forbidden by Kalen's decree, for she was his property to safeguard. "Permit me to pass." A voice, like spun silk, emanated from beyond the guard. Aller appeared, her presence a chilling frost in the warm corridor. She dismissed the guard with an imperious flick of her wrist, and he bowed, stepping aside without hesitation. Aller's continued sway was an obvious, unspoken threat. She glided into Kelly's chamber, her eyes surveying the room with an air of proprietorship, before settling on Kelly, shimmering with a cold, predatory gleam. "Enjoying the silks, little Nanny," she purred, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do not grow too accustomed. He tires of his new playthings rather swiftly." Aller circled her like a wolf appraising its quarry. "He will discard you," she whispered, her voice descending to a conspiratorial hiss. "Just as he discarded me." The words were a perfectly aimed dart, striking the very heart of Kelly's deepest dread. Ara paused at the threshold, turning back to deliver her final, venomous blow. "An Alpha's desperation is not akin to his devotion," she declared, a cruel smile twisting her flawless lips. "Bear that in mind." The door clicked shut, leaving Kelly alone with the chilling resonance of her words. She gazed at her own reflection in a grand, silver-framed looking-glass. A terrified girl playing dress-up, a temporary queen in a gilded cage, already anticipating the day she would be cast aside. Chapter 8. A Sovereign's Secret Heart. The subsequent days dissolved into a monotonous cycle of silent repasts, unoccupied hours, and the pervasive, unsettling vigilance of the guard outside her door. Kelly existed in a state of quiet despair, a phantom haunting the opulent confinement Kalen had orchestrated. The king himself was an enigma, a distant tempest she could sense rumbling through the castle during tense council deliberations, yet one who never approached her. She was his mate, yet he remained a stranger. The distance was agonizing, but perhaps, she mused, it was also a mercy. It was simpler to fear a monster than to comprehend a man. Then, one evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of bruised violet and soft amber, he materialized. He stood in her doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his expression unreadable. He simply said, "Accompany me." Her heart surged into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. He led her through hushed, meandering passageways, his heavy footfalls a stark counterpoint to her own hesitant steps. They moved away from the palatial public spaces, away from the throne room and his private chambers. He was guiding her back to the one place she longed for, the only place that had ever felt like home, the nursery. The 2 royal guards who had been stationed there since the night of the claim had vanished. He pushed the door open, revealing the softly lit room, and there, sleeping peacefully in their cradles, were Lyra and Leo. This was not an order. It was an offering, a gesture of peace. A wave of relief so potent it made her feel lightheaded washed over her. She did not wait for permission. She moved past him, a quiet sigh of release escaping her lips as she crossed the familiar threshold. She went directly to the cribs, her hands moving with an instinct born of love and practice. She smoothed Lyra's silvery wisps of hair, adjusted Leo's blanket, her very presence a soothing balm. The younglings stirred, their tiny noses twitching, sensing her, and then settled back into a deep, contented slumber. This was real. This was who she was in this room. She was not a scandal or a pawn. She was simply Kelly. She felt Callan's presence behind her, a silent, watchful monolith. "They are not merely the Alpha's offspring," he stated, his voice low, roughed with an emotion he could not conceal. "They are my brother's children, my brother Liam and his mate Anya. They were murdered 6 months ago." The confession hung in the air, heavy and sharp with grief. A clandestine assassination, not a random act of violence, as the official narrative maintained. This was a secret that could unravel the kingdom. This was the source of the anguish she observed in his eyes, the restless agitation of his wolf. He was not simply a king burdened by a crown. He was a man fractured by loss, a protector striving to safeguard the last precious remnants of his lineage. He was entrusting her with his profoundest vulnerability, his deepest pain. Who had slain his brother, and why was it being concealed? The questions presented a terrifying chasm, yet they were secondary to the scene before her. A broken sovereign standing vigil over his orphaned kin. In that instant, the apprehension she harbored for him began to transform, shifting into something new, something dangerously akin to empathy, a fierce, protective urge. Not for the Alpha King, but for the grieving man that emerged within her. Hesitantly, she extended her hand and placed it on his forearm. The muscle beneath her palm was taut as solid stone, yet he did not withdraw. "Calain," she whispered, uttering his name for the first time. "Your secret is safe with me." In that quiet vow, everything shifted. She was no longer merely a mate taken by coercion. She was now a custodian of his secrets, a guardian of his heart. And she realized with a chilling certainty that to protect these innocent children, she would have to do more than merely endure. She would have to fight. Chapter 9. The space between. A fragile accord settled between them in the ensuing days. A new, unspoken routine took shape. In the evenings, after the castle had quieted, Callan would fetch her, and they would sit together in the nursery, watching the pups sleep. Occasionally, a servant would bring a bassinet to his cavernous chambers, and they would share a silent vigil by the hearth. It was a peculiar, fragmented semblance of domesticity, a pantomime of a family that was not genuine. Yet, in those quiet hours, she began to perceive beyond the crown and the beast. She witnessed the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the tender manner his large, calloused hand would instinctively caress Leo's cheek, the profound, abiding sorrow that shadowed his countenance when he believed she was not observing. A dangerous warmth began to smolder within her chest, an emotion she refused to acknowledge. This burgeoning intimacy, however, was overshadowed by a mounting tide of political unrest. Callan faced relentless opposition from the elder council. She could discern the faint roar of his displeasure through the thick chamber doors. Lord Valerius's name was frequently uttered with sharp indignation. They were exploiting her. She understood that her tainted lineage was the weapon they wielded to question his judgment, to undermine his authority. Consequently, Callan's protectiveness intensified, becoming an oppressive shroud. He forbade her from venturing beyond the royal wing, insisting it was for her own safety. But it only served to make her feel more like a cherished possession to be guarded, rather than a confidant to be trusted. The more he excluded her from the intricacies of the council's machinations, the more the fragile trust between them began to erode. He was revealing his heart, but he refused to share his burdens, leaving her to feel like one of them. The tension finally erupted one evening. He stormed into his chambers, following a particularly acrimonious meeting, a silent, dark fury radiating from him in palpable waves. He paced before the fireplace, his movements taut, his jaw clenched. Witnessing his distress, Kelly acted on an ingrained instinct, a simple gesture of solace from her former life. She prepared a cup of chamomile tea, its gentle fragrance filling the air, and presented it to him. "Callan," she said softly. He paused, turning to face her. As he looked at her, at the simple offering in her hands, the rage in his eyes seemed to simply dissolve. It was replaced by a raw, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. He reached out, his hand closing over hers on the warm cup, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Kelly," he breathed, his voice thick with a desperate longing that made her knees weak. The air in the room grew heavy, crackling with an unspoken need that had been simmering between them for weeks. He gently took the cup from her, setting it aside with a soft click. He did not release her hand. Instead, he used it to draw her closer until only inches of charged air separated them. The space between them vanished. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the world seemed to contract to this single, heart-stopping moment. He leaned in, his scent of pine and wild ozone overwhelming her, his lips parting slightly. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. Just as his lips were about to meet hers, he recoiled as if struck. A look of furious self-disgust contorted his features. He released her hand, turning his back on her so abruptly it felt like a physical blow. A low, guttural snarl escaped him, but it was not directed at her. It was aimed at himself. "Leave!" he rasped, his voice a broken, jagged sound. The rejection was more agonizing than any insult could ever devise, more piercing than the scorn of the entire pack. She stood there, frozen, her heart aching with a confusion and hurt so profound it stole her breath. The intimacy had been genuine, she was certain of it, but the barrier he maintained between them was just as real and far more formidable, and she was left reeling, realizing the greatest peril to her heart was not the scheming counsel or a jealous rival, but the tormented sovereign who had claimed her soul, yet refused to grant her entry. Chapter 10. The Spark of Defiance. A suffocating tension had become the new standard. For weeks following the near kiss, Kaylin was a looming storm on her horizon, a distant, watchful, and dangerous presence. The gilded cage had begun to feel smaller, the air thinner. Kelly, weary of observing the world through a pane of glass, finally discovered a sliver of courage. She did not ask for permission. She stood before him one morning, her posture erect, and declared she was going to the castle gardens. After a prolonged, silent contest of wills, he conceded with a curt nod, on the condition that his guards would surround her. It was a compromise that still felt like a tether, but the promise of open sky was a balm she desperately required. The gardens, however, were not the sanctuary she had anticipated. A group of nobles had congregated by the rose bushes, their laughter brittle and sharp. Among them was Lord Marius, one of Valerius's most insolent allies, his face fixed in a perpetual sneer. He observed their approach and made no move to depart, his presence a deliberate provocation. He did not address Kelly directly. Instead, he let his gaze sweep over her before turning to a companion, his voice carrying easily on the breeze. "It is a pity, is it not?" he drawled, loud enough for all to hear. "That the pups of a true alpha like Liam are now being raised by that." The insult was exquisitely cruel, aimed not at her title or her lineage, but at the one pure element in her existence, her devotion to the children. The former Kelly would have wilted under his scorn, her shame a familiar cloak. But something different occurred this time. Hearing him use the pups, her pups, as a weapon to wound her, did not break her. It ignited a spark of defiance deep within her soul. She stopped, turning to face him fully. Kaylin tensed beside her, a low growl beginning in his chest, but she subtly raised a hand, a silent request for him to hold back. Her heart was hammering, but her voice, when it came, was as calm and clear as a winter morning. "You are mistaken, my lord," she stated, her eyes meeting his. The entire garden fell silent. The only pity here is that a noble title is squandered on a man who possesses neither the honor to respect his king's choice, nor the basic decency to respect the memory of a fallen alpha and his beloved mate. She took a deliberate step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Perhaps you have forgotten who their father was. I have not." She let the words linger in the air, a reminder of a secret she shared with the king, a veiled threat that she was not the ignorant, powerless nanny he perceived her to be. The arrogant sneer on Marius's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of shock and uncertainty. Before the humiliated lord could utter a reply, Callan moved. He was a blur of dark fury, closing the distance in a single, fluid stride. A choked gasp emanated from Marius as Callan's hand shot out, seizing the front of the Lord's fine tunic and lifting him effortlessly off the ground. "You will not speak of my mate," Callan snarled, his voice a lethal rumble, his eyes blazing with golden fire. "You will not speak of my kin." He slammed Marius back against a stone archway, the impact fracturing the ancient stone. "If you ever do so again, I will tear the tongue from your worthless throat." He dropped the sputtering, terrified noble to the ground in a heap. The message was brutally, unequivocally clear. The public humiliation was a warning, the violence a promise. Later that night, as a shaken but strangely emboldened Kelly walked the torchlit corridor back to her chambers, the lesson had evidently been learned. The whispers had ceased, but they had been supplanted by something far more perilous. A silent, black-feathered arrow suddenly thudded into the stone wall, mere inches from her head, its shaft quivering from the force of its impact. The game had changed. They were no longer attempting to shame her. They were attempting to kill her. Chapter 11. The Unlit Bond. The castle was now a fortress within a fortress. Guards patrolled every corridor, their faces grim, their silence a constant, oppressive reminder of the arrow that had nearly claimed her life. Kelly was alive, but she was more of a prisoner than ever. Callan was a tempest of contained rage and suffocating guilt. His presence, a constant vibrating energy, left no room for tranquility. The failed attempt on her life had frayed the last strand of their fragile accord, and it finally snapped. It occurred in his chambers, the air thick with unspoken fear and resentment. "This is your fault," she finally cried out, the words tearing from her, raw and ragged. "This confinement you maintain, this protection, it achieves nothing. It only paints a larger target on my back." His control, stretched thin for weeks, shattered. "I am striving to keep you alive," he thundered, his voice reverberating against the towering stone arches. He swept his arm across a table, sending a silver pitcher and its accompanying goblets crashing to the floor. "I am trying to cling to the sole beacon in this desolate, monochrome existence that holds any significance." Their disagreement ignited like a wildfire, consuming all the unspoken truths they had long suppressed. Every one of her anxieties, all of his suppressed frustrations, erupted into the void between them, a deluge of anguish and fury. It was within the heart of this conflagration that he finally allowed his truth to surface, a revelation more devastating than any assassin's blade. "How am I supposed to safeguard you when the connection itself refuses to properly manifest?" he bellowed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his frame quivering with the sheer force of his admission. "It is incomplete. It feels fractured," he confessed the dire secret he had been concealing. A genuine bond of mates, he elucidated, was meant to be a surging current of shared vitality, of intertwined perceptions and emotions. It served as a bulwark, a weapon, a sacred union. But theirs was merely a fleeting shimmer, a feeble, insubstantial spark, because his inner wolf, the very essence meant to solidify their connection, was too profoundly damaged, too shattered from whatever ordeal had transpired in the north. He could project her essence. He could sense the draw, yet the ultimate critical link remained unlit. These words struck Kelly with the impact of a physical assault, stealing the breath from her lungs. Ara's venomous whisper echoed in her mind. An alpha's desperation does not equate to his devotion. It was unequivocally true, every bit of it. He had not selected her. He had grasped at a remedy, a cure that was now proving ineffective. Her most profound vulnerability, the ingrained belief that she was inadequate and dispensable, was cruelly exposed, raw and bleeding. She was a flawed solution, a disgrace. The pain was a tangible entity, a crushing weight pressing upon her chest. She longed for it to cease. She wished to disconnect the faulty, broken filament that was inflicting such profound suffering on them both. With tears streaming down her face, she moved toward him, her body functioning on an automatic pilot. Her decision was absolute. This was the only solace she could extend to either of them. She met his blazing, tormented gaze, the words of repudiation forming on her lips, a final, annihilating release. "I," she began, her voice a fractured whisper. But as she opened her mouth to utter the ancient, binding words, she perceived it. Beneath the fury, beneath the desperation, she glimpsed the unvarnished, unadulterated terror in his eyes. The formidable and terrifying Alpha King was gripped by an overwhelming, absolute dread of losing her. That solitary, unguarded flicker of his own broken heart silenced the utterance on her tongue. She could not speak it, yet the unvoiced rejection now hung suspended between them, a poison far more lethal than any arrow, a silence that threatened to engulf them both. Chapter 12. A touch of moonlight. The ensuing silence was a living entity, vast and suffocating. The rejection she had left unspoken resonated louder than any clamor, a final fracture in the foundation of Colin's disintegrating composure. He stared at her, the terror in his eyes gradually being supplanted by a surge of pure agony. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips, and he clutched his head, his formidable physique commencing to convulse. The emotional torment, layered upon the deep, festering wound in his spirit, was simply too overwhelming. The dam within him shattered. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as his bones began to contort, his form twisting in a grotesque, unnatural manner. His cry of pain was no longer human, but a monstrous, bestial sound that ripped through the room. This was not the swift, controlled transformation of a werewolf in command of his inner beast. This was a violent, agonizing unraveling, a creature of sheer rage and torment clawing its way to the surface. He was ensnared between man and wolf, his eyes glowing with a mindless, golden ferocity. And all of that torment was directed at her, the source of his hope, the source of his torment. The partially transformed monstrosity lunged. There was no time to flee, no space to contemplate. The chamber filled with the sound of its snarls, the sight of its massive, clawed hands reaching for her. In that heart-stopping, world-ending instant, something profound within her shifted. Fear was eclipsed by a peculiar, sudden tranquility. An instinct she had never known she possessed took hold. She did not scream. She did not recoil. As the beast descended upon her, she extended her hand. Her palm, small and pale against the tempestuous surge of his dark fur and shifting musculature, pressed flat against the center of his chest. And then it occurred. A gentle, silvery white luminescence, as cool and delicate as a moonbeam, flared from her palm. It was not a weapon of force or flame, but of profound serenity. The ethereal glow penetrated his being, a silent, soothing wave that met the raging inferno within him. The creature's enraged snarl faltered, collapsing into a whimper of bewilderment. The violent tremors that racked his body ceased. The golden fury in his eyes dimmed, clearing like dissipating smoke, revealing the astonished human gaze of Kalin beneath. The tempest within him, the restless beast that had tormented him for years, was quiescent. For the first time since she had encountered him, his wolf was utterly, completely at peace. He stumbled backward, the residual effects of the monstrous transformation receding, leaving him fully human, panting and unsteady. He stared at her hand, then at his own chest, a look of stunned disbelief etched on his face. She looked down at her own palm, a tremor coursing through her. Where had that light originated? What had she just accomplished? The moment of shared astonishment, of miraculous, terrifying discovery, was shattered by a sharp, urgent rapping at the chamber door. A guard burst in, his countenance pallid. "My king, we have apprehended one of the assassins. He is alive." Kalin, his expression a mosaic of conflicting emotions, tore his gaze from Kelly and strode out to confront the new crisis. But as he departed, Kelly observed a figure lingering in the shadows of the hallway. Lady Era. Her countenance was a study in cold, calculated comprehension. She had not witnessed the precise events, but she had perceived the flash of silvery light emanating from beneath the door. She had observed the raw astonishment on Callan's face. She now understood with absolute certainty that the unassuming governess was not merely a fleeting infatuation or a desperate solution. She was something more, something potent. And the look in Ara's eyes was a fresh, far more perilous vow. She would ascertain Kelly's true nature, and she would annihilate her for it. Chapter 13. The Queen's Gambit. In the quiet days that followed the night of the silver light, a new and disquieting dynamic took root between them. Callan now regarded her with a bewildering confluence of awe, confusion, and a fear that bordered on reverence. He maintained his distance, as if she were a celestial body to which he dared not approach too closely, lest he be consumed. But Kelly understood that concealment was no longer a viable option. That peculiar dormant power within her, coupled with the overt threat from his adversaries, meant she could no longer afford to remain unseen. Survival necessitated a revised strategy. She located him as he was preparing for the morning's council assembly, the atmosphere in his antechamber, thick with the aroma of leather and his own palpable tension. He anticipated her wishing him well and withdrawing. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and uttered two words that irrevocably altered the trajectory of events. "I'm coming." This was not the action of a frightened servant being led to her doom. This was a deliberate choice, a conscious step into the heart of peril. She was undertaking this because the younglings deserved a future unburdened by the shadows that plagued their protector. She was doing it because she was weary of feeling like the catalyst for Callan's troubles, rather than his confederate. And she was doing it for the timid girl who had spent a lifetime believing she ought to be imperceptible. As they traversed the grand corridor towards the council chambers, a tangible wave of shock rippled through the castle staff. They moved not as sovereign and subordinate, but as a unified front, his potent strides matched by her own determined gait. She sensed the stares, the amalgam of stunned disbelief from the servants, and the frigid, undisguised animosity from the nobles they encountered. Each scrutinizing gaze was a test, and with every step she resolved not to falter. Upon entering the council chamber, the low murmur of conversation ceased instantaneously. The atmosphere became rigid. Lord Valerius and the half-dozen other elders were seated around the immense stone table, their countenances hardening into visages of cold animosity at the sight of her. Callan strode to his designated place at the head of the table, the Alpha's throne, a formidable structure crafted from dark wood and wolf pelts. However, instead of gesturing for her to stand behind him or in a corner, as would befit a proper attendant, he simply nodded towards the vacant space to his right. The seat was unadorned, yet its placement was symbolic, a position that had remained unoccupied for years, a seat reserved for the Luna. The challenge was unspoken, yet it reverberated across the room. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic percussion of apprehension and exhilaration. Every eye in the chamber was fixed upon her, anticipating her misstep. She would not grant them that satisfaction. With a fortifying inhalation, Kelly traversed the stone floor, her footsteps echoing in the charged silence. She reached the position beside the king, and rather than taking a seat, she simply stood, her hands clasped loosely before her. She met Lord Valerius's glacial glare, and for the first time she did not flinch. She was trembling, a subtle tremor running through her entire frame, but she held his gaze, her spine as rigid as solid steel. This was her declaration. "I am present. I am his mate, and I harbor no fear of you." The council meeting commenced, the discussions of trade routes and border patrols, a meaningless drone beneath the actual silent conflict being waged. When it finally concluded, as the elders filed out, their robes rustling with indignation, she overheard Valerius's low, venomous murmur to another. "She is becoming excessively audacious. This cannot persist." The other elder's response was a chilling assurance. She must be dealt with prior to the coronation, or all will be lost. Her strategic maneuver had succeeded. They no longer perceived her as a pawn. They recognized her as a formidable threat that required elimination. Chapter 14. A Taste of Betrayal. An unsettling quiet descended upon the castle in the week that followed, the sort of tense stillness that portends a storm. Kelly, emboldened by her minor triumph, began to establish a presence for herself. She even believed she had discovered an ally. A young serving girl named Lena, possessing wide, guileless eyes and a gentle smile, was among the few who did not treat her as an outcast. Lena would bring her sustenance, sharing inconsequential fragments of innocuous gossip, her warmth a welcome balm in the cold, hostile environment. Kelly had begun to place her trust in her, to perceive her as a small beacon of light amidst the overwhelming darkness. That trust would prove to be her undoing. One evening, Lena arrived with her customary dinner tray, but accompanying it was a special goblet of dark, spiced wine. "A gift, my lady," she offered, her smile as sweet as ever, "to help with the nerves." Grateful for the simple gesture of benevolence, Kelly accepted the beverage, savoring its warmth as it descended her throat. The effect was not immediate. Initially, it was a pleasant heat that permeated her limbs, a welcome relaxation, but the warmth soon yielded to a creeping numbness. Her fingers felt heavy, her thoughts sluggish and viscous. When she attempted to stand, her legs refused to cooperate, buckling beneath her. A chilling dread washed over her as her vision began to blur at the periphery, the vibrant hues of the room fading into a murky gray. Something was terribly, dreadfully amiss. She stumbled towards the door, a silent scream trapped in her throat, which felt as if it were constricting, suffocating her from within. Then the world plunged into darkness. Kalen discovered her. The sound that tore from his chest was not human. It was a roar of pure, apocalyptic grief and rage, a sound that vibrated through the very foundations of the castle. He bellowed for guards, for healers, his voice the sound of a world being rent asunder. The court converged, drawn by the terrifying sound, only to be confronted by the sight of their king, losing his struggle for self-control. Claws, as long and black as obsidian, ripped through the skin of his fingertips. His eyes blazed with the untamed fire of his wolf. The agony of witnessing her demise on the floor shattered his sanity, and he turned on the onlookers. A maelstrom of destructive fury, a half-transformed beast, teetering on the precipice of slaughtering every individual in the room. As the darkness threatened to claim her entirely, Kelly perceived the monster he had become in his sorrow for her, and in that terrifying, sublime moment, she felt no fear. With the last vestiges of her strength, she propelled herself forward, her hand reaching out to grasp his face, now contorted in a snarl of torment. His skin was hot, his cheek bristling with coarse fur. She pulled him down, her voice a choked, ragged whisper that somehow possessed greater resonance than his fury. "Kalen," she breathed, her touch a final, desperate anchor. "I am not afraid of you." Her words, her touch, pierced the crimson haze of his rage. It was the only thing that could have halted him. He froze, the beast in his eyes receding, replaced by the terrified man. With a sob that sounded as if it were wrenched from his very soul, he scooped her lifeless form into his arms, his physique still quivering on the precipice between beast and man, and roared for the royal healer. His love and his fury were now indivisible, a terrifying, inseparable force, and the question of who had betrayed her was secondary only to the possibility of her survival. Chapter 15. Trial by Fire. She endured. The royal healer's ancient wisdom, combined with a peculiar, resilient life force within her that actively combated the poison, pulled her back from the brink. She awoke weak but alive. The betrayal had incinerated her last vestiges of fear, replacing them with a cold, unyielding resolve. The castle was in disarray. Lena, the sweet-faced servant, had vanished. Her disappearance served as a clear confession of her culpability and her allegiance to the council. Kalen, now consumed by a singular imperative to both avenge her and solidify her position beyond any shadow of doubt, embarked on a desperate gamble. He invoked the Luna Trials, a series of ancient, perilous rites of passage, designed to validate a mate's worthiness to the pack and the very gods, It was a tradition that had lain dormant for centuries, and it represented his final act of defiance against his adversaries. The inaugural trial commenced at dawn in the sacred grove, a circle of ancient, moss-covered monoliths pulsing with primal magic. It was a trial of the spirit. Kelly was tasked with traversing a winding, ethereal path to retrieve a moonstone from the grove's heart, all while confronting spectral illusions designed to manifest her deepest fears and insecurities. Lord Valerius and the other elders were present to preside, their faces impassive masks of stone. All observed from the edge of the clearing, a smug, predatory smile gracing Ara's lips, convinced that the unassuming governess would be shattered by her own inner demons. As Kelly stepped onto the path, the surrounding world shimmered and transformed. The murmurs of her past rejections and the visages of scornful nobles swirling around her like phantoms in the mist. She pushed through them, her focus narrowed on the glint of the moonstone ahead. But just as she neared her objective, the trial was disrupted. A contingent of black-clad assassins swarmed into the sacred grove, their blades gleaming in the dawn light. This was the council's final desperate maneuver to assassinate her during the trial, thereby claiming the sacred magic itself had rejected her. Chaos erupted as the royal guards engaged the assailants. In the ensuing melee, one of the assassins broke free, his gaze alighting on an easier, more strategic target. Within a specially designated pavilion for the ceremony, Lyra and Leo lay in their bassinet. The killer perceived his opportunity to inflict the deepest possible wound upon the king. Kelly saw him as well. Without a moment's hesitation, she abandoned the trial, her own safety disregarded, and launched herself forward, a desperate protective instinct overriding all other considerations. She threw her body in front of the bassinet, shielding the pups with her own person just as the assassin's dagger plunged downward. A searing, white-hot agony exploded in her shoulder, but the pups were secure. Kalen, having just subdued another assailant, witnessed the entirety of the act. He observed her bleed to protect his kin, his future, his heart. For him, the trial had concluded. She had proven her worth not through mystical prowess, but through a love so fierce it defied mortality. As he roared and charged the final assassin, Ara saw her own opportunity amidst the pandemonium. With Kelly wounded and Callan preoccupied, she stepped into the center of the grove, her voice ringing out with triumphant malice for all to hear. She bleeds with courage, I shall concede that, but it is the courage of a traitor's whelp. She shrieked, her words reverberating off the ancient stones. Her blood is a contagion. She is the offspring of Maris and Lorien, the very wolves who betrayed the last king and attempted to sell this pack to our sworn adversaries. Her moment of greatest heroism was instantaneously overshadowed by the public revelation of her deepest shame. Her family's ultimate transgression laid bare for the entire world to witness. Chapter 16. Sins of the Father. The echo of Ara's accusation, daughter of Maris and Lorien, lingered in the stunned silence of the sacred grove. The words were a death knell. The sharp, throbbing pain in Kelly's shoulder was inconsequential, a distant inferno compared to the conflagration of shame and horror that consumed her. Now she could feel the very air transmute. The pack members who had witnessed her brave act, who had seen her bleed for their future alphas, now regarded her with a dawning, sickening dread. The fleeting spark of respect in their eyes was extinguished, supplanted by the familiar, ugly glint of suspicion and hatred. In the span of a single breath, she had been transformed from a heroine back into a curse. Her family's transgression was a specter that would haunt her eternally. Lord Valerius, his countenance a mask of righteous indignation, seized the opportune moment. He strode into the center of the clearing, his formidable voice booming with authority, transforming the pack's confusion into a weapon. It all becomes clear now, he declared, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Kelly, who remained slumped against the bassinet, Kalen a furious bulwark at her back. This is not the king's jaded consort. This is a viper we have welcomed into our midst. He did not merely condemn her parents. He distorted the events of the preceding months into a sinister narrative. the king's peculiar fixation, the assaults on her life orchestrated to portray her as a victim. It is all a fabrication, a venomous scheme to perpetuate the treason her parents initiated. The accusation was masterful in its cruelty, a poison that seeped into the ears of the already apprehensive pack. This was it, her absolute nadir. Wounded, exposed, and now implicated as the orchestrator of a conspiracy she could not even comprehend. The faces in the crowd, once distinct individuals, now blurred into a singular, monstrous entity of judgment. Their low, enraged growls were a physical force pressing in on her, suffocating her. Her deepest, darkest fear, the core tenet that she was a blight upon the world, screamed its triumph in her mind. You see, you are not merely unworthy. You are a poison. Kalen held her more tightly, his own snarl a defiant roar against the escalating tide. But even he could not stem the deluge. She stands accused of high treason, Valerius boomed, his voice resonating with finality. By the ancient statutes, there is but one consequence. She must be executed. The demand for her demise rippled through the onlookers. A chant of justice and traitor arose from the throng. The royal guards who had just fought to protect her now exhibited uncertainty. Their loyalty was divided between their alpha king and the undeniable weight of pack law and tradition. Their spears, which had been directed outward at the assassins, now seemed to be slowly turning inward, forming a tense, glittering cage. Kalen clasped her to his chest, his movements betraying a furious, desperate defiance. He carried her from the copse, not as a victorious leader with his mate, but as a beleaguered sovereign retreating with his accused, disloyal partner. She pressed her face into his chest, the fragrance of his wrath offering a peculiar solace amidst the utter ruin of her existence. She had been hailed as a heroine and a traitor in the same breath, and now the pack she had preserved was baying for her life. Chapter 17. Sovereignty versus Sentiment. Her shoulder had been cleansed and swathed by the royal physician. The physical injury, a sharp, burning line of discomfort. It was a concrete testament to her allegiance, a confirmation of her sacrifice, and yet it signified nothing. In the estimation of the pack, the scar she would bear was merely another emblem of her perfidy. Callan remained with her in the chambers that had become her confinement, but he was no longer a ruler exuding authority. He was a tormented individual, pacing the confines of the room like a caged predator, his impotence a far more chilling spectacle than his fury had ever been. The diadem weighed like lead upon his brow. His dominion, an entity he could no longer command. A royal courier, a young wolf with a pallid, apprehensive countenance, arrived with the tidings that sealed their destiny. Lord Valerius, in his self-righteous indignation, had successfully marshaled the other aristocratic lineages. Their missive presented an ultimatum: surrender the progeny of the traitor for adjudication and execution, or they would withdraw their allegiance. They would fracture the realm, plunging the community into a sanguinary, internecine conflict, kinsman against kinsman, until the stain was eradicated. The nation Colin had pledged his existence to safeguard, the populace he cherished, the heritage of his forebears. It was all on the verge of being rent asunder, owing to her, owing to his decision. The anguish etched upon his visage was an image she would forever cherish. He was being crushed between two insurmountable affections, his obligation to his subjects and the primal, innate imperative to shield his consort. Witnessing him so demolished, so utterly fractured, awakened the specter that resided within her. The age-old, familiar conviction that she was an encumbrance, a blight, an expendable entity whose sole worth lay in its obliteration. Her life was not commensurate with the spilled ichor of a single pack member, let alone the devastation of an entire polity. Affection, she comprehended in that devastating instant, was not about clinging. It was about releasing. With tears coursing down her cheeks, she approached him, her hands finding his, her touch a desperate entreaty. "Release me, Kalen," she implored, her voice fracturing with a sob. "Yield me to them, I beg you. Do not permit the pack to bleed on my behalf. My existence, it is not worth such a cost. It was the ultimate demonstration of her own inner desolation, a desperate endeavor to validate the terrible falsehood she had perpetually harbored about herself. He regarded her, his golden eyes a tempest of dilemma, his every primal urge as an alpha, as a male who had discovered his counterpart, shouted at him to protect her, to fulfill his vow, to incinerate the world for her. But the burden of the crown, the eons of duty imprinted upon his very being, demanded the sacrifice. It was a choice that would irrevocably damage him, regardless of the outcome. As they remained locked in that dire, silent impasse, a figure materialized in the entryway. All the sentries had been unable to detain her. The council's authority was now paramount. She observed Kelly, not with triumph, but with a facade of gentle, calculated compassion that was considerably more cruel. "Oh, you pitiable, unworldly creature," she whispered, her tone a venomous caress intended solely for Kelly's ears. "Do you not perceive the inevitable conclusion of this affair?" She glided closer, her gaze flitting to the tormented king. "He is an alpha. Ultimately, a true alpha invariably safeguards the pack. He will invariably prioritize the realm." She allowed the pronouncements to permeate, a final, devastating venom before departing, gliding away. Kaylin's tortured reticence in the face of her plea felt like an affirmation. Ara was correct. The decision had already been rendered. Chapter 18. The Cost of a Spirit. The Grand Assembly Hall had been repurposed for a spectacle of judgment. The sounds of festivity had receded, supplanted by a profound, expectant quietude. Kelly stood upon an elevated wooden dais in the heart of the spacious chamber, confronting the grim-faced council and the assembled throngs of the pack. She felt a peculiar, hollow tranquility descend upon her. She had embraced this outcome. Her demise would be her ultimate act of devotion, the sole method of rectifying the world she had contributed to fracturing. The injury to her shoulder throbbed, a dull ache that tethered her to the present juncture. She was prepared. Lord Valerius officiated, his voice resonant with grim satisfaction as he enumerated the fabricated accusations. He spoke of her progenitors' perfidy with lurid detail, ultimately disclosing the full, contorted rendition of their transgression, the dissemination of pack intelligence, the facilitation of an enemy ambush that had resulted in the loss of numerous lives. He portrayed Kelly not as their unblemished descendant, but as their patient, vengeful legacy. The substantiation was insubstantial, mere whispers and shadows, but the pack, desperate for a scapegoat, absorbed it all. Just as Valerius raised his appendage to proclaim the unavoidable verdict of execution, the colossal portals of the hall swung open. Kaylin entered. But this was not the sovereign they recognized. He wore no coronet, no regal adornments. He was clad in unadorned ebony leather, his countenance pallid and drawn, yet his eyes held a terrifying, resolute composure. He did not proceed to the vacant throne. He traversed the parted multitude, his steps measured and deliberate, until he reached the dais where she stood. He confronted the council, his gaze sweeping across them, devoid of animosity, filled only with a profound, deeply ingrained sorrow. "You demand recompense for the transgressions of the past," he stated, his voice subdued, but resonating with such potency that it permeated every recess of the hall. "You deem her to be that recompense. You err." He did not contest. He did not entreat. He offered them an exchange. He withdrew the ancient ceremonial stiletto from its scabbard at his waist and placed it upon the dais between them. Then, in a gesture that elicited a collective gasp of astonishment from the entire pack, he twisted the Alpha King's sigil ring from his digit, the emblem of his dominion, the very core of the realm. "I am the recompense," he declared, his voice breaking beneath the weight of his own pronouncements. He positioned the ring adjacent to the stiletto. "I shall relinquish my sovereignty. I shall abdicate my authority and cede my power to this council." He regarded Valerius, his eyes aflame with an unconditional adoration that served as a formidable weapon in itself. "I shall surrender my crown, my dominion, my entire existence in exchange for hers." the world ceased to spin. This singular, unattainable act dismantled Kelly's entire comprehension of her own value. He was selecting her, not merely over his own life, but over his sacred obligation, his legacy, his very essence. He was attesting in the most unequivocal manner imaginable that she was not expendable. The realization was a devastating, exquisite agony. She could not permit him to undertake this. She would confess her culpability. She would lunge for the stiletto herself. She would undertake any action to prevent him from incurring this cost. She parted her lips to refuse, to immolate herself as she had perpetually intended. At that precise instant, a solitary, pure shaft of incandescent light pierced through a high window, illuminating the dais in an ethereal luminescence. The full moon was ascending. A low, guttural sound of anguish emanated from deep within Callan's chest. It amplified into a mournful cry of heart-rending suffering as his physique began to convulse violently, the strain of proffering his own soul for hers, finally breaching the fragile hold he maintained over his damaged, tormented wolf. Chapter 19. Lunar Ichor. Callan's lamentable cry was the resonance of a spirit rending itself asunder. He was disintegrating, shattering beneath the insurmountable burden of his sacrifice. The lunar radiance, an unyielding spotlight upon his torment. The pack, moments prior a cohesive throng of condemnation, was now a chaotic assemblage of apprehension and bewilderment. In that instant, observing his unraveling for her sake, something within Kelly transmuted. The quiet, desperate aspiration to depart, to preserve him, was incinerated, supplanted by a ferocious, undeniable compulsion to exist for him, to contend for him, to extricate him from the abyss into which he was voluntarily precipitating himself for her benefit. The beam of moonlight streaming through the window did not feel frigid as it caressed her skin, her bandaged shoulder. It felt like a surge of vitality, an influx of improbable warmth that coursed through her veins like a river of liquid starlight. The murmurs regarding her progenitors, the architects of her lifelong shame, echoed in her consciousness. But the pronouncements were altered now. They were no longer an indictment, but an inquiry. What if the narrative you were imparted was a fabrication? What if her ichor was not a contaminant, but a legacy of something entirely distinct, something feared, something potent? As Callan's physique commenced to contort, the agonizing transformation threatening to engulf him entirely, she moved, disregarding the panicked exclamations from the council and the gasps from the pack. She re-entered the dais. She was no longer a victim awaiting pronouncement. She was a woman advancing towards her predestined path. She placed both her palms flat against his chest, directly over his heart. This occasion, it was not a flicker. It was a deluge. A brilliant, blinding torrent of silvery white effulgence erupted from her palms, permeating his physique. The luminescence was cool, calming, and it carried the improbable aroma of nocturnal blooming jasmine and ancient consecrated locales. The entire assembly hall collectively gasped. The lunar light within the chamber seemed to bend, converging its focus, channeling itself directly through her. With the surge of power came a disorienting influx of ancestral wisdom, visions, and sentiments that were not intrinsically hers. She perceived countenances through her vision, felt puissance in her grasp, and she comprehended. She was not the progeny of betrayers. Her lineage was a rare, venerable, and sacred entity. They were lunar saviors, a succession of wolves possessing the faculty to pacify the untamed beast, to mend the spirit, to channel the goddess's very essence. Her progenitors had not been traitors. They had posed a menace to a dark force of antiquity, and they had been eliminated, their legacy perverted into a malediction. The flaw she had borne her entire existence, the source of all her suffering, was never a flaw at all. It was her paramount strength. Her touch accomplished more than merely arresting his agonizing metamorphosis. The argent luminescence penetrated deeper, locating the ancient, festering wound upon his spirit. The damage incurred from the northern engagement, and it commenced to assuage the scarred spiritual tissue. The tormented fury in his eyes receded, replaced by a dawning, blazing optimism as he gazed upon her, truly perceiving her for the initial epoch. He was not merely observing his consort, he was observing his deliverance. Across the hall, Lord Valerius and the elders regarded with abject consternation the instrument they had employed against their sovereign. The narrative of her tainted ichor had just been annihilated by a demonstration of divine, miraculous efficacy. The traitor they had condemned was, it appeared, touched by the goddess herself, and in the stunned, reverent quietude, a new, terrifying query began to coalesce. What have we wrought? Chapter 20. The Pact of Blood. The grand hall was ensnared in a state of stunned, absolute silence. The marvel had left them bereft of breath. Calin, his wolf steady and placid for the initial epoch in 5 agonizing years, seized the advantage. He took Kelly's hand, his grip no longer a brand of possession, but a gesture of profound companionship. He led her from the dais, his gaze daring anyone to contest them now. For the initial epoch, the council was silent. They were too astounded, too apprehensive of the divine power they had just witnessed, to even articulate. Residing once more in the sovereign's chambers, the world had been recreated. He was no longer merely her protector. He was her devotee. He regarded her with a reverence that humbled her. The magnificent Alpha King brought to his knees, not by coercion, but by a grace he had never conceived of existing. She, in turn, was infused with a confidence she had never known, a quiet fortitude that stemmed from finally comprehending her own intrinsic value. "My progenitors," she commenced, her voice clear and resonant, recounting to him all that she had perceived, all that she now apprehended. "They were not traitors, Calin. They were healers. I surmise someone within the former sovereign's retinue apprehended their puissance, and thus they were framed, eradicated. Collectively, they examined the fragments of the enigma, the council's desperate, vicious campaign against her, Lord Valerius's obsession with her contaminated ichor. It was all constructed upon a foundation of falsehoods, a convenient narrative employed to subjugate the pack and the throne for epochs. But how might they substantiate it? How might they demonstrate to the pack that her puissance was a benediction, not a curse? Calin, his intellect sharp and lucid, now that the static of his injured wolf had dissipated, spoke of a legend, a perilous, forgotten ceremony. The Pact of Blood, he stated, his voice low and intense. A ceremonial union performed beneath the effulgence of the full moon before the entirety of the pack. We would offer our ichor, our spirits, our very souls to each other and to the goddess. It is the ultimate prerogative. If it succeeds, our bond will be absolute, a connection no one can ever negate. Your puissance will be enshrined as a divine endowment." He paused, his gaze earnest. "But if it falters, it could annihilate us both. Our spirits could be consumed." It was an all-or-nothing gamble, a leap of faith that would either salvage their dominion or precipitate its utter ruination. There was no alternative course of action. "We shall proceed," Kelly declared, her voice unwavering. Their affection, her puissance, and his diadem were now a singular, interwoven thread. As they stood in unison, a novel cadre forged in lunar luminescence and revelation, the chamber portal burst inward. A royal sentinel, his countenance pallid and lacerated from a wound upon his cheek, stumbled forth. "My sovereign," he panted, breathless. "Lord Valerius, he has enacted his stratagem. He and his adherents are storming the royal wing. The fortress has been breached. He has infiltrated assassins within." The sounds of conflict, the clash of steel, the snarls of warring wolves erupted from the corridor. A sudden, violent verity descending upon them. Their sacred, hopeful scheme had just intersected with the council's final murderous act of desperation. The confrontation was no longer a matter of political machinations or arcane rituals. It was present. It was now. And it was for their very existences. Chapter 21. A queen's inaugural engagement. The substantial oak portals of the chamber splintered, exploding inward in a cascade of detritus. Assassins. Their visages grim masks of zealous devotion poured into the room, their blades held at the ready. They represented the council's final, sanguinary rejoinder. But Kaelin was prepared. With a bellow that was pure, unadulterated alpha dominion, he permitted his wolf to assume control. The transformation was instantaneous, a breathtaking whirlwind of shadow and might. Where the man had stood, a colossal obsidian wolf now occupied his place, its form more voluminous and formidable than she had ever witnessed him, its golden eyes blazing with the clear, frigid luminescence of a sovereign engaged in warfare. He was no longer a broken beast. He was magnificent. He met the assassin's onslaught like a tidal wave cresting against a rocky precipice, a tempest of dark fur, gleaming talons, and snapping jaws. The confrontation was a whirlwind of brutal, chaotic ferocity. Kaelin was an elemental force, his every maneuver a testament to the alpha sovereign he was perpetually destined to be. He battled to defend his chambers, to safeguard the progeny, to protect her. But there were an excessive number of them. Their assaults were coordinated, their objectives singular. They sought to bypass him, to reach the true focal point of the council's animosity. The progeny, awakened by the terrifying clamor of the engagement, commenced to wail from the modest, sheltered alcove where they slumbered, their cries of terror slicing through the din of battle, piercing Kelly's very heart. The residual vestiges of the apprehensive, cowering nursemaid burned away in that instant, consumed by a conflagration far more incandescent. She was no longer a servant to be rescued. She was a Luna, and this was her den. An assassin, swift and wiry, eluded Kaelin's flank, his poisoned dirk elevated, his gaze fixed upon the sounds of the crying infants. He perceived them as leverage, as a vulnerability. He was mistaken. Kelly moved without deliberation. Her apprehension transmuted into a pure, primal ferocity. She seized the weighty, ornate chair she had been occupying and swung it with a desperate strength she had not known she possessed. The solid wood impacted the assassin's flank with a resounding thud, causing him to falter, his assault thwarted. She was not a trained combatant. She wielded no armament, but she was a mother protecting her young. Her raw, courageous act provided Colin the singular moment he required. He pivoted, his colossal jaws enclosing the assailant, bringing the threat to a permanent conclusion. For that one incandescent moment, she had contended alongside him, a partner in combat. As the engagement raged on, a desperate assassin executed a final lunge, his poisoned blade inscribing a deep laceration along Colin's flank. The sovereign's wolf emitted a pained yelp, but dispatched the final adversary before the venom could exert its influence. As the last foe succumbed, Kaelin faltered, his colossal form wavering, a whimpering sound escaping his throat as the poison commenced its lethal progression. He collapsed upon the floor, the magnificent wolf suddenly defenseless. Without a moment's hesitation, Kelly was at his side. She pressed her palms against the bleeding, blackened wound, invoking the strange, silvery power residing within her. But it proved insufficient. The venom was excessively potent, excessively swift. Acting upon an instinct deeper than cogitation, she performed the unthinkable. She bit down with considerable force upon her own wrist, rupturing the skin, and pressed the bleeding wound against his. Her ichor, the sacred ichor of a lunar healer, hissed as it encountered his tainted flesh. The argent luminescence flared, no longer merely soothing, but aggressively purifying, neutralizing the venom and commencing to mend the ruptured musculature. As the sounds of the broader engagement echoed beyond, she knelt upon the floor of their despoiled chambers, tending to her fallen sovereign with her own life force, affirming her worth not to a council or a pack, but to him in the most visceral manner imaginable. Chapter 22. Two spirits, one inferno. The aftermath of the engagement was a ruin of splintered timber and prostrate figures, but through the pandemonium, a new, fragile order was being forged. Kaelin, weakened from the poisoned blade but whole in spirit, stood alongside her. His wolf was a placid, steady presence within him, a quiet hum of power where a tempestuous storm had once resided. They stood in the heart of the grand hall, encircled not by adversaries, but by the stunned, wide-eyed survivors of the pack. They had witnessed her heal him. They had witnessed her contend for the progeny. They had witnessed a marvel, and it had rendered them speechless. The full moon, elevated and immaculate in the nocturnal firmament, poured its argent luminescence through the fractured, stained-glass windows, bathing the scene in a consecrated radiance. This was the juncture. There would be no subsequent occasion. With a fortitude that appeared to emanate from Kelly herself, Callan addressed his populace. His voice was raw yet resolute, reverberating within the cavernous, silent hall. He apprised them of the council's decades of deception, of their conspiracy to control the throne, of the authentic, noble lineage of the individual who stood beside him. Then he elevated his voice, a sovereign issuing his ultimate, binding declaration. The edicts of humankind have failed us. The traditions of the past have been transmuted into instruments of aggression. Tonight, we shall not place our faith in the pronouncements of wolves, but in the volition of the goddess herself. He regarded Kelly, his eyes replete with unreserved trust. We shall perform the pact of blood here, presently, and permit the moon to serve as our witness and our arbiter. A collective gasp of dread and awe swept through the pack. The pact of blood was a fable, a legend, a ceremony so perilous that no individual had ventured to undertake it in 5 centuries. Callan procured the ceremonial stiletto from the belt of a fallen sentinel, the very blade he had once proffered with his coronet. He did not hesitate. He inscribed a sharp, clean line across his own palm, the dark ichor welling instantaneously. Then, with a reverence that caused her heart to ache, he clasped her hand. His touch was infinitely gentle as he inflicted a matching incision upon her delicate palm. The sting was a distant entity, inconsequential. He pressed their bleeding hands together, flesh against flesh, ichor against ichor. As their wounds merged, the lunar glow within the chamber seemed to concentrate, solidifying into a singular, intense radiance that enveloped them both. Kelly sensed his spirit intertwine with hers, perceiving the raw, untamed might of the Alpha King, his steadfast devotion, and his profound love for his people. In turn, she unfurled her own essence to him. She felt the lingering, ashen traces of the injury sustained during the northern skirmish, the spiritual haze that had afflicted him for years, and she channeled her silver luminescence into it, purging the final vestiges of darkness. In reciprocity, his fortitude surged into her, a tempest of pure alpha power that, rather than overwhelming her, made her whole. It dissolved the last faint echoes of self-doubt, the final phantoms of her past, filling every void within her with his unshakable faith in her. The fragile, flickering ember that had connected them for months did not merely ignite, it detonated, it exploded into a blazing, transcendent conflagration. Their spirits became inextricably bound, their thoughts and feelings merging until they were no longer 2 distinct entities, but rather 2 halves of a singular, flawless unity. A surge of pure, divine energy emanated from their clasped hands, a silent, potent benediction that washed over every wolf in the hall, bestowing a feeling of profound peace, of absolute rectitude, of a sacred equilibrium restored. And in perfect, unprompted accord, every wolf present in the grand chamber, whether noble, guard, or attendant, lowered themselves to one knee, not in deference to their king alone, but to their king and their queen. Chapter 23. The Kneeling King. The divine energy gradually subsided, leaving behind a stillness so pure and hallowed it felt akin to a prayer. The vast hall was filled with the quiet, humbling tableau of the entire pack, bowed in reverence. Kelly surveyed the expanse of bowed heads, her heart a tempest of emotions too immense to articulate. The unseen governess, the ostracized Omega, the traitor's offspring, all those vulnerable, shattered aspects of her former self had vanished, consumed in the crucible of the blood oath. She was Luna, and she had arrived home. Callan gently released her hands. She looked down to observe that his palm and her own were entirely healed, marked only by a slender, shimmering silver line on their skin, an enduring physical emblem of their united souls. He turned to her, and the adoration shining in his golden eyes was so deep, so absolute, it outshone the moonlight itself. Then he performed an act that defied 1,000 years of tradition, a gesture of devotion so revolutionary it would be recounted for generations. The Alpha King, Callan the Unbroken, victor of countless battles and sovereign of the most formidable pack on the continent, slowly, deliberately knelt before her, before his mate, before his queen. He took her hand, not with the possessive grip of a ruler, but with the gentle homage of a devoted follower. "Kelly," he stated, his voice resonant with emotion, yet clear enough for every wolf to discern. "You confronted my adversaries. You mended my wolf. You salvaged my spirit." His gaze was a pledge, a vow more binding than any law. "My existence, my dominion, my heart, they have perpetually belonged to you. From the instant I perceived your melody, I was yours." This marked the dawn of a new era, not of a king who commanded his mate, but of a king who knelt before her, their strengths interwoven, their power a flawless, indissoluble circle. As if on cue, a slight stir arose from the side of the hall. A trusted guard, his countenance alight with joy, gently guided two small figures forward. Lyra and Leo, their tears dried, their fear abated, tottered on unsteady limbs across the stone floor. Their gazes fixed upon the one individual in existence who represented their true north, they bypassed the kneeling king and proceeded directly to Kelly, their tiny hands clutching the hem of her attire. They looked up at her, their faces radiating a pure, unadulterated adoration that healed her remaining hidden wounds. This was the sole affirmation, the sole acceptance that had ever truly mattered. With a laugh that was half a sob, Kelly sank to her knees, mirroring her king, and gathered the two cubs into her embrace. Their small, warm forms settled against her as if they were extensions of her own soul, their familiar scent a soothing balm to her spirit. She gazed from their trusting countenances to her kneeling king, to her devoted pack. The gnawing emptiness in her chest, the specter she had carried since childhood, had finally and irrevocably vanished. This was her family. This was her pack. The realm was no longer a domain of apprehension and secrecy, but one forged in a love that had endured fiery trials and been blessed by the moon itself. She was home. Chapter 24. Always my queen. Weeks later, the grand hall was utterly transformed. The scars of conflict had yielded to garlands of ethereal white moonflowers, their sweet, intoxicating fragrance perfuming the air. Silver banners adorned with the newly adopted emblem of a black wolf and a silver moon intertwined hung from the vaulted ceiling. This day was not for judgment or conflict, but for festivity, for coronation, for the promise of a fresh commencement. As Kelly stood at the rear of the hall, a tremor of apprehension coursed through her, yet it was a sensation of joyous exhilaration, not the chilling dread of her past. She no longer feared being observed. She was prepared to be revealed. The music commenced, a gentle, exquisite melody that spoke of optimism and rebirth. She proceeded down the lengthy aisle, her steps measured and assured. The entire pack was assembled, and as she passed, they regarded her not with disdain or suspicion, but with genuine, heartfelt reverence and affection. Just ahead of her, Lyra and Leo toddled along, scattering moonflower petals with a gleeful, uncoordinated abandon. They reached the dais where Callan awaited, the expression on his face, the pure, unadulterated happiness radiating from within him, made him appear younger, dispelling the final shadows that had long oppressed him. He was more than a monarch. He was a man profoundly, truly, and completely enamored. He eschewed the participation of an elder in presiding over the ceremony, deeming it too personal, too sacred. He took her hands in his touch a source of both solace and a thrilling tremor. a guard presented the Luna's crown upon a velvet cushion. It was not a heavy, opulent artifact of gold and precious stones, but a delicate, ethereal circlet of interwoven silver, sculpted in the form of entwined moonflower vines, with a single, flawless pearl nestled at its center. Kaelin lifted the crown, holding it aloft for the pack to behold, but before he placed it upon her head, he uttered his final vow to her, and to them, a testament to their shared journey. "The world perceived you as a servant," he declared, his voice resonating with a passion that enthralled every soul in the hall. "They saw you as a governess, a whisper in the corridors, a shadow to be disregarded. They were blind." He met her gaze directly, his soul laid bare for her and for the entire world to witness. His voice softened, transforming into an intimate promise intended solely for her, yet audible to all. "I see you, Kelly. From the very instant I heard your voice, my spirit recognized yours." He smiled, a genuine, breathtaking display of unadulterated joy. "You were never merely the governess. You were never a mere placeholder. In my heart, you were always my queen." With infinite tenderness, he gently settled the silver crown upon her head. It rested as if crafted for her, a cool, lightweight symbol of destiny. The pack erupted, not in a formal ovation, but in a joyous, unrestrained roar of affection and jubilation. Kaelin leaned in and kissed her, a deep, passionate embrace, filled with the promise of countless tomorrows, a future they would construct in unison. As they finally parted, he drew her close, the pups now cradled securely in their arms, a perfect, complete family gazing out at their united, hopeful domain. The invisible girl was gone forever, and in her stead stood a beloved queen. Her worth, no longer a subject of inquiry, had become the unshakable foundation of a new world.